We're often told that building social housing is just a matter of political will. But what if it's actually a matter of math? Today, we're digging into a report that pulls back the curtain on a really fundamental and often misunderstood truth about the UK housing crisis. Social homes are basically designed to lose money. So let's break down exactly why that is and what it really costs to fix it.
So, first things first, the report completely reframes the problem. It argues this isn't just some temporary crisis. No, they call it a permacrisis, a permanent state of emergency that demands we think about this in a totally different way. And the scale of this emergency? Well, it's just staggering.
Let's just start with this number, 1.33 million. That is how many households are on local authority waiting lists for a home right now in England. Just let that sink in. That's millions of people waiting and waiting for a stable place to live.
And of course, it's the most vulnerable who are hit the hardest. 164,000 children are currently living in temporary accommodation. Can you just imagine the instability, the constant disruption to their schooling, to their entire lives? And the really scary part is, the data shows this number is growing, and it's growing fast.
These numbers, they're not just stats on a page. They're a symptom of a much, much deeper problem. And it really forces us to ask a very basic question. Why on earth are we failing so badly to build the social rent homes that we so obviously need?
Well, according to this report, the answer lies in this huge but really common misunderstanding about the basic finances of it all. The simple fact is, social homes just don't pay for themselves. Let's get into why that is.
I think we've all probably heard this before, or at least kind of assumed it was true. The idea that, sure, it costs a lot to build a social rent home, but over decades and decades, the rent you collect will eventually cover the construction cost. It makes perfect sense, right?
Well, the hard financial reality laid out in this report is a completely different story. From a purely financial point of view, social rent homes are loss-making projects from day one. They are designed in a way that means they will never recoup what it costs to build them. So here's the core of the problem. There's this massive, permanent financial gap. On one hand, you have the total development cost, everything it takes to actually build the home. And on the other, you have its capital value, which is basically what it's worth based on the very low, subsidized rent it can generate over its lifetime. And that development cost is always way, way higher.
And a huge piece of that puzzle, something that almost always gets missed in the public debate, is this thing called the cost of capital. Look, it's simple. There's no such thing as free money. Whether you borrow from a bank or use government funds, that money has a cost. It's just like interest on a mortgage. You have to pay for using that money over time.
And the consequence of that is just crystal clear. Once you factor in that cost of borrowing, the low rent from a social home is just never, ever enough to pay back the initial investment. In fact, get this, the report's modeling shows that even after 80 years, the initial debt is still not paid off.
Okay, so understanding that fundamental financial black hole is absolutely key. Because once you get that, you start to see why so many of the common, simple solutions you hear about for the housing crisis, well, why they just don't work.
I'm sure you've heard these ideas thrown around, right? Just use free public land, or let's get some innovative private finance. They sound good, they sound simple, but they all fail because they completely ignore that fundamental viability gap we just talked about. They're trying to solve a problem without even acknowledging its root cause.
Let's just take the most popular one, using free public land. The report's analysis on this is really clear. Free land definitely helps, of course it does, but it doesn't solve the problem. In fact, and this is the real kicker, the financial models in this study were already calculated assuming the land was totally free, and there was still a massive funding shortfall. So, if all those simple solutions are basically myths, what's the real answer? What's the actual price tag to build the social homes that we so desperately need?
The report's conclusion on this is blunt, and it's unavoidable. You cannot have subsidized housing without a subsidy. It's that simple. So the real challenge is facing up to the true scale of that subsidy. It's not a question of if we need it, but just how much. And here it is, the big headline number. To deliver the 90,000 social rent homes that groups like Shelter and Crisis say are needed each year, this is the annual public investment required, £18.83 billion every single year. Now, let's just break that huge number down a bit. The average subsidy needed for each home is over £209,000. Now, to put that into perspective, the government's previous grant program for affordable homes averaged only around £64,000. The gap between what's needed and what's been on the table is it's enormous.
Now I know a number that big sounds pretty intimidating, but the report makes a really compelling case that we need to reframe our thinking on this completely. We shouldn't be seeing this as a cost, but as a strategic national investment. And it's one with some pretty significant financial returns.
Think about it like this. Right now, local councils are forced to spend £2.8 billion a year on temporary accommodation, things like B&Bs and hotels. That's money that builds zero long-term assets. It creates no lasting benefit. It is a recurring, unsustainable cost that just vanishes into a black hole. But investing in permanent social homes? That completely flips the script. The money saved on that temporary accommodation bill flows straight back to the government. You build more homes, you create more construction jobs, which means more tax revenue. And maybe most importantly, better, stable housing leads to better health outcomes, which reduces the long-term strain on the NHS. It transforms a cycle of cost into a cycle of genuine investment.
And this really does reframe the entire debate, doesn't it? This is no longer just about balancing a budget. It's about finally acknowledging that good, stable housing is essential national infrastructure, every bit as critical as our roads, our railways, or our power grid.
In the end, it all comes back to this one simple, unavoidable economic truth at the very heart of the report. And just accepting this fact is the first and honestly the most critical step towards finding any kind of real, workable solution.
And this really gets to the crucial social argument. This isn't about charity. This is about providing stable homes for our key workers, for young families, for the people who form the very backbone of our communities and our economy. People we need.
Ultimately, the report leaves us with a really powerful final thought. It suggests that the true cost of doing nothing, measured in skyrocketing temporary accommodation bills, worsening health outcomes, and growing social inequality, is far, far greater than the cost of the investment itself. So the real question isn't whether we can afford to do this, it's whether we can truly afford not to.